butter.
Well, I think just to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll go ahead and get started. I know one or two people will join us as we get going. We're now going to have a guided conversation on racial inequities. And just as Anita had said earlier, unfortunately, due to technical limitations, we weren't able to have this be live streamed on YouTube, but we are going to record it and put it up online because we want everything we do through this process to be transparent to the public. It's all about faith, people having faith in what we're doing and what we want to accomplish. We have moderators too, Doctors Ronda Taylor Bullock and Daniel Bullock. They are co-founders of We Are, which stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. Dr. Ronda Taylor Bullock earned her doctorate at UNC Chapel Hill in Policy Leadership and School Improvement Program. Prior to her entering the doctoral program, she taught English at Hillside High in Durham for about 10 years. Dr. Daniel Bullock earned his undergraduate degree from UNC Chapel Hill and doctorate from NC State University. So you can see the Bullocks are not only a house divided, Daniel is a person divided between the Pack and the Tar Heels. He is currently the executive director for equity affairs in the Durham Public Schools. And at this point, I'm very happy to hand it off to Ronda and Daniel.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Ronda Taylor Bullock, and as was previously mentioned, I am the co-founder and executive director of We Are. We Are stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. I'm joined today by my forever partner, Dr. Daniel Kelvin Bullock, but I'll allow him to introduce himself.
Yeah, so glad to be here with you all this morning. Dr. Daniel Kelvin Bullock. My primary role as it relates to this type of work is I'm the executive director for equity affairs in Durham Public Schools. And I've been working in Durham Public Schools for just over 15 years now, but I'm also co-founder of We Are. So I'm here to support Rhonda today in We Are. And so I'm a co-founder of We Are, and I'm also a board member with We Are.
All right, and just so that you all know, We Are is a local nonprofit organization. We're housed in Durham. We provide anti-racism trainings for children, families, and educators. We use a three-pronged approach to dismantle systemic racism in education and beyond by offering summer camps for kids in rising first through fifth grade, professional development for educators, and workshops for parents and families. And oftentimes we are invited to be in spaces that are slightly outside of the educational realm, and we welcome and are thankful for those opportunities as well. We wanted just to reiterate that we're not doing a workshop today, and we're not doing professional development. We were tasked with guiding you all through a conversation to somewhat ground you all in the very important work that you all will be doing moving forward. We know that one conversation will not be sufficient as far as helping you all to develop and add on to the racial equity lens and perspectives that you all already have. But the team thought it would be great to have some type of grounding work and conversation as we move forward. Just to give you all an overview of what we're going to be doing with our time, I'm going to share a little bit more about We Are, just because I think that's important in building relationships and connecting community. You all need to know, well, who is this organization that's up in front of us that's going to be tasked with grounding us? And then I'm going to share a little bit more about my background and how I came to do this work. And then we're going to jump into having some conversations. We're going to do some whole group type discussions and learning, and then we're going to be breaking out into smaller groups, so it won't always just be Kelvin or myself up here in front of you all. And so that's how we're gonna proceed, and we hope that we provide a learning space that will impact you all as you continue to move forward. So before we hop in, it's important that we ground ourselves in norms. In having these conversations about race and racism, each of us are carrying different stories as it relates to this topic. Some of us are carrying stories as victims. Some of us are carrying stories as perpetrators. And some of us are somewhere in between. And it's very important that when we engage in these conversations, even when you all engage with them without us, that we are bringing our most thoughtful selves into this space. And so we're going to go over these norms pretty quickly. So first, we want to practice deep listening. Some of the ways to do that is to listen and ask questions to understand rather than to respond. We're going to try not to interrupt one another. We're going to practice step up, step back. Meaning if you haven't said anything in this space yet, we want you to step up and contribute. And if you've been talking a lot, we want you to kind of check yourself and step back and allow space for others to join the conversation. We'd like for you to be present. The time today is limited and you all's time is precious, and so we don't want to waste it. Be mindful of reactions to content and dialogue in your body. Okay? We're going to ask you to check defensiveness when it arises and make space to listen. And to check your defensiveness, we're going to ask that you pinpoint that by rubbing your ears, tapping, press down on the seat of your chair, feel the weight of your body, and get grounded. And ask yourself, what about this is making me uncomfortable? Then we want you to lean into that discomfort, because that's the place where transformational learning will occur. We'd also like for you all to utilize gracious honesty.
From there, we also ask that you say what you mean, meaning when you speak, consider your purpose in sharing. We want to avoid generalizations and use I statements. Also assume the best intentions, but also maintain a focus on outcomes and impact. We want to be open and willing to learn. And as Rhonda has said, expect and lean into any discomfort we may feel. One of the things we can do to keep us mindful of that is to allow constructive friction, meaning that if we're engaging in a conversation and there's a little friction in that conversation or discomfort, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with a little friction, but we do want it to be constructive, and we do want to move productively into a place of solution together as a team. We need to expect and accept a lack of closure. We're not going to resolve issues of racism in society or in the criminal justice system overnight. If we didn't get here overnight, it will take time. And also we want to relinquish the feeling to critique the presentation, instead focusing on the content.
And just to add there, we're not above critique. We certainly want feedback. But if you're doing that during the presentation, you're missing the content, right? Okay, so just wanted to be clear about that. So I mentioned that I would share a little bit of background information about us and some of the work that we do, again, so that you all can understand who are these people in front of you? What is this organization? So real quickly, a couple of things that we do. Annually, we host a conference that's called Let's Talk Racism. We co-sponsor this event with North Carolina Central University School of Education, the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke, and then Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. We say that we end the conference with ice cream and organizing. This would have been our 5th year of hosting the conference. Unfortunately, if you check the dates, this was the week before everything started shutting down. And so we made the decision the Thursday before, and then by that Friday, everyone else in the state and the country was starting to make these decisions about canceling events. So what we're going to do is we're going to postpone our conference till next year at around the same time. Our keynote speaker is going to be Dr. Cheryl E. Matias. She was at a University of Denver, Colorado. She just got a new job at University of Kentucky. And she'll be speaking on our theme, Becoming Anti-Racist Educators. And even though this isn't an educational space that we're in right now, we welcome folks from other disciplines who can come and talk about racism in education. If that's something you're interested in doing, we would love to have you all lead a breakout session, maybe even provide updates and be able to share with the community about the Racial Equity Task Force. We have about 500 people who are scheduled to participate this year, coming all across the country. Everyone was just not coming from North Carolina. These next 2 flyers represent annual events that we do for educators. Again, while our target audience is educators, we have people from all disciplines, all professions, community members, parents, just people who want to be in this space and having these conversations. So on the first flyer was our Educator Summer Institute, which we just held 2 weeks ago, and we were able to do it virtually since we could not be in person. And so again, the purpose of that institute is to bring educators together to learn about how racism is structural and how it intersects with the educational system. We encourage folks to come in teams of 3 because we spend time in the evenings naming a systemic racial inequity issue in their local context, and we help them develop a plan to address it once they go back to their local setting. We had about 65 teachers from across the country who joined in that virtual session about 2 weeks ago. Later on this fall, we hope to have an in-person, but it may be virtual as well, 2-day curriculum workshop. We get a lot of ask about how are you having these conversations with young children? So people want to know, can you start a camp here, start a camp there? Can we have your curriculum? And so we decided to bring folks to us for 2 days to share our anti-racism framework and to also share our anti-racism curriculum that we use for kindergarten through 5th graders. And so that will be later on this fall as well. And then this was our flyer for our summer camp. It's definitely one of the highlights of our year. We do a summer camp for kids in rising 1st through 2nd grade, and then another one for kids in rising 3rd through 5th grade. We use a literacy-based approach to help children think about race, racism, skin color, activism in very concrete ways. Whatever book we teach from, we give a copy of it to the kids so that they have one, and by the end of the week, they have a home library of 5 books that, again, help them think about and wrestle with race, racism, skin color, and activism. This year, we were scheduled to have 2 camps in Durham and 2 camps in Greensboro. But again, due to COVID-19, we had to cancel. We started these camps in 2016 with about 15 kids. This summer, we were scheduled to have about 140. And so we've grown exponentially, and we're just thankful that parents want to send their kids to an anti-racism summer camp. These are pictures of our kids from 2019. We had about 63 children from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. We also provide scholarships, full and partial, for kids so that finances are not an inhibitor from participating. We had wanted about 50 kids. We ended up taking 63. These are our 1st through 2nd grade campers. We had about 55. We wanted 30. That's a lot of kids, but if that many parents want to send their kids to an anti-racism summer camp, then we decided to hire more staff and to accommodate them. So I mentioned that I was going to share a little bit more about my background and how I came to do this work. I am a critical race scholar. I do critical whiteness studies specifically. I study white children's racial identity construction. As a part of critical race theory, one of the tenets is that the stories from marginalized communities matter, that they should be moved from the margin to the center. And so I share part of my story, which is also Kelvin's story, in fulfilling that tenet. So in this first picture here, you see Kelvin, my husband. He and I met as rising high school seniors through a minority student recruitment program at UNC Chapel Hill called Project Uplift. At the time, he and I both went to an education breakout session, and I was like, look at this Black man into education. Let me get to know him. And so we did. And we both took the North Carolina Teaching Fellow Scholarship to UNC Chapel Hill. While we were there, we were best friends in undergrad. He was in the friend zone. But by December, our senior year, we decided to start dating. And as of October 1st this year, we will have been married for 15 years. We did the Master of Arts in Teaching program at UNC Chapel Hill together as well. And then we left there to go teach at Hillside High School in Durham. Hillside is one of the few remaining historically Black high schools in our state. He was in the social studies department. I was in the English. We had a few kids that overlapped, gave us a hard time, as you know, students will. But while Kelvin ended up staying there for about 5 years before he left to go get his PhD at NC State, I stayed for about 10. It was a little harder for me to leave. While we were there, we had 2 children. We have a son named Zion, who's now 9, and a daughter, Zaire, who's 6. And I tell people, when you become a parent, your whole life changes. See some head nods. When you become a parent and you do anti-racism work, your life really changes because you start to think about your own personal experiences and what you went through and how you want to prevent your kids from having those same experiences. Even though that's an unrealistic expectation, that doesn't stop us from trying. And so when I think about when race became real to me, I think back to being 5 in kindergarten. I was sitting at a round table and one of my classmates went around and invited everybody at the table to her birthday party except for me. I was the only Black kid at the table. So I noticed, that wasn't fair. So I just asked, I said, hey, I noticed you invited everybody at the table to your birthday party except for me. Why did you do that? And she said, well, you can't come to my birthday party because my dad said Black people are not allowed in our home. I didn't really understand what that meant. Remember, I'm 5. So I go home, I tell my mom the story. And I remember her looking at my dad shocked. And so she said to me, well, Rhonda, we don't invite ourselves to other people's birthday parties. I was like, okay, Mom, I didn't think that's what I did, but I was like, okay, Mom, that answer sufficed. And it worked for me until it happened again at 7. So at 7, I'm in Girl Scouts. Any former or current Boy Scout, Girl Scout leaders have some type of connection, a few of us. We were out doing a community service project trying to earn a badge. And it just so happened that year I was the only Black kid in Girl Scouts. So all of the girls were in a huddle talking, and when I walked up on them, they stopped talking. What does that mean when you walk up on a group of people and they stop talking? Somebody take yourself off mute and tell us. What does it mean when you walk up on a group of people and they stop talking?
They're talking about you.
They're talking about you.
They're talking about you. Thank you. And so I pulled my best friend out of the group and I said, hey, when I walked up, you all stopped talking. That was kind of weird. Why did you do that? And she said, Rhonda, please don't be mad at me. I'm having a birthday party later today and my dad said that you can't come because you're Black. I understood more at 7 than I did at 5, or so I thought. At this point, I'm thinking something's wrong with me and my skin color because it's keeping me out of these spaces. I go home again and I tell my mom, and this time I'm more visibly upset because I got it, like I knew I'm being excluded. But that time my mom, her answer was different. That time she spoke with me about racism. She spoke with me about slavery. She spoke with me about Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves. Now, although as adults, we know that relationship with Lincoln was a little more complex than what my mom could explain, but she didn't have We Are helping her. And she spoke with me about white people hating Black people because of the color of our skin. I share these stories with you all because I've been awakening since 5. I've been paying attention to race and racism since a very early age. And these are the stories that undergird my why and how I came to do this work, why I think it's imperative that we do with young children. I heard someone mentioning that earlier. The work has to begin with young children. And it's also why I believe in doing this in multiple spaces, because all of our communities and our lived experiences are interconnected. It's not happening in isolation. All of our experiences are interconnected. So as I share this story with you all, I want us to sit with, when did race become real to you? Part of doing anti-racism work is about hearing the stories of other people. And sometimes we want to go and do work in other communities and do work on behalf of people, but we haven't really sat with that story and that narrative for ourselves. And it is important that we sit with that narrative for ourselves and also that we hear other people's stories. So what we're going to do, we're going to go into breakout rooms. And for those of you who feel comfortable, we want you to engage in a conversation and share your story. When did race become real to you? Something that I want to challenge us to do when we do these stories, that we first prioritize the voices of people of color if they feel comfortable sharing. Like, we're not forcing anyone to share, but we want to prioritize those voices as we're pushing back and challenging racism and white supremacy in different ways. We're going to make space for people of color in your breakout group. But again, we want everyone to share, because it's not just, race doesn't just become real to folks of color. Race is real for all of us, and we want you all to engage in community in that way. Are there any questions before we head out to our breakout session? All right, you should see an invitation to join a breakout room.
Hello, my name is Kerwin Pittman, and so my first experiences was kind of like the first two speakers was at an early age. So I was visiting a place called Tarboro, North Carolina, in Edgecombe County, and so I was about the age of 7 years old, and we was in a convenience store, me and my cousins. It was about maybe five of us. But it was a long line in a convenience store. So finally, after a good portion of the patrons paid for the items, um, I finally almost made it to the counter, and it was a white cashier, older male, and he began to point out the individuals behind me and my cousins to come up to the cash register, and pay for the items first. And it, as a kid, it kind of jarred me. You know, I really didn't think too much of it. I just said, okay, well, maybe because they're adults, so he's gonna do the kids last. And so we went to the store a couple times after this, not really, and it continuously happened. So one day I asked my father, I said, um, Dad, why is it when we go to the store, the kids have to go last? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, when we go to the store, it's always the adults, the cashier will point the adults out to go before us. And so he asked me, he said, what do the adults look like normally? And I said, they're white. And he said, well, son, it's a thing called racism. And he said, and I'm going to be sure to have a talk with this store clerk. And I'm pretty sure you had to talk with him because it never happened again. But that was my first experience dealing with racism promptly in my face.
Thank you for sharing that. This is Angelica. And so for me, you know, I'm sure it probably happened way before this, but the one that I can still remember in my memory, in my body, and so forth was when I was in the 3rd grade. I was walking home, or the bus dropped us off, and we were walking home, myself and my younger brother, who was like 2 years younger than me, I believe, so he would have been, kindergarten, maybe 1st grade. And we were walking, and school bus passed, and all the kids started yelling out the window, like, "Wet back," and all these other things. And I remember thinking to myself that, you know, that, I mean, it bothered me that they called me that, but I think it bothered me more that my younger brother was subjected to that. And, you know, and then as time went on, because I am a woman of color, I am a brown person, I just happen to have light skin due to colonization. But, and so what that means for us, especially in the South, is that there's this idea of what a brown person looks like and what a brown person doesn't look like. And so because of my light skin, I've been privy to certain tables, certain conversations where people can relax, and then they end up saying like really racist things in front of me. And so it's just something that occurred, like I was just more cognizant of later. And then when I would point out like, hey, I'm not a white person, and they would be like, oh yeah, but you're different. And I never understood what that meant, but I guess I should have asked them. But that was probably my most like vivid memory around race.
I grew up in a mixed race family. My father was Black, my mother was white, and I grew up in the 60s. So this was a long time ago, it seems like now. I can't ever remember not being conscious of of the tension, of the conflict that we caused just existing as a family at that time. It wasn't very common to have mixed race families. I would say my first personal experience of outright racial hostility came, we were the first Black family to move into a white neighborhood, and one of our neighbors, when my brother and I were riding our bikes up and down the sidewalk, turned her garden hose on us, you know, as an expression of, you know, we don't want you here, we don't want you in our neighborhood. And you know, I think times have changed in a lot of ways in terms of how many more mixed race families there are now than there were back in the 60s. But that would have been one of the early personal experiences of racial hostility that I had. So I don't know how long they're going to leave us in this chat room, but the question is, when did you first become aware of race?
We have 4 more minutes in this chat room. So if anybody hasn't shared, they're more than welcome to. I can, but I want to leave task force members the option.
Sure, Ellen, go ahead.
So I think my first experience of race, I went to a city public school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I would say that the school is probably 30% white and then about 70% Black. And I do remember quite consciously seeing a difference in the way my Black classmates were treated compared to me in a disciplinary way. And as a young kid, you don't quite understand why that's happening, but you certainly know that there's a difference between the way you're being treated and other people are being treated. And I can remember having those conversations with my parents, and them being very direct and honest. My parents were not a group to say, you know, everyone's created equal, that kind of, or everyone is viewed equal, everyone's created equal, but everyone's viewed in the same way. They were very direct and honest about the inequities that exist in our world and how wrong those are. But I can probably remember having those conversations as young as maybe the 2nd or 3rd grade. So I think that's when I first became aware that I was being given an advantage that felt very unreasonable to me as a young child, because you don't sort of internalize that until much later. Oh.
I'm hoping I'm working this correctly. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
This is my first time on a Zoom meeting, so please bear with me. We've had a lot of conference calls, but Zoom is new to me. I grew up in a very rural farming community in Brunswick County. So really thinking back, since the question was asked and listening to the stories, my first real exposure to racism was actually when I went into law enforcement. I went in 1991, and what prompted me to get into law enforcement was the neighboring community in our area was predominantly Black, and an officer that had been with the sheriff's office for quite some time had come by. He was good friends with my dad, and he saw me working out on the farm, and he looked at me and said, boy, you ever thought about going into law enforcement? I said, no, sir, not really. And he said, well, you ought to think about it. And so I ended up going and applying and got involved with the sheriff's office. And shortly after, that's when we had some encounters with people in positions of leadership being very racist towards other members of the agency that I'd become very good friends with. And that's sort of what really sticks in my mind all those years ago as to when I really realized how divided our community was in some respects with regards to racism.
So I think we're going to close out in about 20 seconds, but we'll come back into this same group in about 30 minutes. Hopefully this all goes seamlessly and I see you guys back in the main room. Okay. Still somewhat of a question mark.
Going back to the main group. That was just my thought on that.
My father said that if the other teams didn't want the African-American boys on their team, he would take them all on our team. And Little League was integrated. But there was a lot of animosity toward my father and toward me and my mother because of that. But the flip side of that was, over the years, I grew up in that small town, and my dad was really appreciated for what he did. And I've always felt fortunate. Again, I'm not saying there was no racism in my house and that I haven't at times been racist, but I was certainly taught not to be, and I had very good role models. But the Little League situation was when I realized there was anger around race.
Mr. Woodall, thank you. And just for the benefit of everyone, he was sort of in the middle of his comments when we got pushed back out into the main session. Yeah. Also, on behalf of my group, I want to apologize to Ms. Callahan, who was also kind of in the middle of her statement of sharing. Sorry we weren't able to finish that up.
One of the things that I'll say right now is, first of all, thank you all for engaging in that conversation, because for some of us, those memories are traumatic. And it does take a level of vulnerability to share those stories in mixed race spaces. And also we know it wasn't enough time, right, for everyone to go or to have every story shared. We do have a few minutes because we're slightly ahead of schedule. Is there anyone who would like to, if you didn't get to speak or if you were mid-story, if you would like to share your story with us right now? And you can just unmute if you'd like to do that. In education, we call that wait time, because sometimes it takes some of us a little bit more space to mash that unmute button or to speak up. So sometimes when you see us pausing like that, we're just giving y'all wait time to decide. So I'm gonna just ask again, just another 10 seconds if anyone else wants to share their story. If you didn't get the opportunity to share your story today, or you didn't get to finish, you all will be working together for the next 5 to 6 months, and that those stories matter. Those stories build humanity. They connect us to our humanity. And when we're able to share in experiences, I like to tell people that white supremacy hardens our hearts, and it prevents us from empathizing with other people and reaching across the lines and building that community. And so when we share, we're chipping away, and we're holding space for our humanity and our ability to connect with people from whom we identify and people from whom we are different. So I encourage you all to continue that story sharing as you begin to move your work forward.
All right, so at this time, we have 4 terms posted on the screen. And within the chat, if we could utilize, do we have the chat feature?
We don't actually.
Oh, okay. So if we could have maybe, we'll just see if we have some volunteers just to raise their hand or give us a sign to let us know if you'd like to respond to what comes to mind when you see each of these terms. So we'll just quickly start with racism. When you see racism, what comes to mind? Do we have a volunteer to share?
Again, or just for you all, when you're sharing, we're just thinking about what first comes to mind. Not, you don't have to phone a friend. You don't have to Google to give us Webster's dictionary definition, but we just want to know what pops in your head. And it might be a definition or it might be something else, but what are the first things that come to mind when you see those terms? And first starting with racism.
Double standard.
Okay, thank you. Double standard. Other initial thoughts?
Barriers.
Barriers.
I think it's handcuffs and just folks being arrested and locked up and keys thrown away.
Not a level playing field.
Okay.
Exhaustion.
Exhaustion.
And you know what, as we're calling these out, can I ask that maybe Ellen or someone a part of the planning team, it would be helpful to jot these down and we can track the things that you all are saying, and then, you all can bring them up later on in meetings.
Okay, yeah, those are phenomenal. Let's move forward to white supremacy. What comes to mind when you hear that phrase?
The Confederate flag.
Okay, Confederate flag.
So it's interesting you asked that. We're doing this exercise because Dr. Bullock had used white supremacy a couple times, and I'm sitting here going, what is the definition for that? Because for me, when I hear it, it's like I instantly think of the KKK or some hate group, and I think in the manner in which she's used it today, it means something totally different. So I want to try to get an understanding of a different version or a different explanation of white supremacy than what I believe it to be.
I feel like that is such a key issue, and the fact that I think we as a society and we frankly as white people are rethinking our understanding of white supremacy and ways in which it still pervades without necessarily the white robe and or the white whatever the Ku Klux Klan was.
All right. So originally, so we're hearing Confederate flag, we're hearing KKK, the attire that the KKK would wear. That's what we're envisioning with white supremacy. Any other responses? What comes to mind when you see white supremacy?
Well, I think now the foundation of our nation.
Okay, foundation of our nation.
A structural system that uplifts whites above all others.
A structural system that uplifts whites above others. Okay.
Anyone other than white doesn't belong.
Okay.
I think Old South, when I hear people make a definition about the Old South and they try to masquerade it as if it's about heritage and history, I think of white supremacy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think about not the real outward forms of white supremacy, but almost on the part of white people like me. Sometimes there's a subconscious entitlement that you feel.
Okay. All right. I think it was might have been Kerwin earlier who said the word system in his response. Let's get some people to say a little bit more about what comes to mind when you see that word system.
The rules by which things are organized.
Okay. Rules by which things are organized. Okay.
I would say historical establishment placed in place.
Okay. Historical establishment in place. All right. Anyone else?
With system in mind, I think of strategic operations.
Strategic operations. Okay. All right. And finally, racial equity lens. What does that mean? What comes to mind?
Viewing the world through a lens where there is equity based on race, because that is what's needed instead of equality.
Okay, can I ask you to say more about equity versus equality? Why did you bring up equality?
Because equality means we all get to go through the door, but like Mr. Wells, who's representing those who are disabled, he may need a ramp to get through the door. So we're going to have equity to make sure that everyone can get through the door properly. And there's that diagram at the baseball field that really shows it well that I hope everyone's seen. If not, Dr. Kelvin, you can share it with them someday.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure I have it somewhere. Yeah. Okay.
I appreciate Deborah for mentioning that, because I think the disability community really does sort of show that all of us have diversity and differences. And so it's not necessarily about everybody being treated the same, for fairness and for justice to happen. And so ways in which we have that sort of equality, it's more than equality.
I just want to say briefly also on the, just thinking about disabilities, there's an image I've seen where there's snow across a ramp and across steps. And, so someone is trying to shovel the snow off of the steps. And someone points out, well, if you just shovel the snow off of the ramp, everyone would have access, including someone who may have a disability. So when you take care of the one who may have the most needs, it's going to clear the way for everyone else too. So when you take care of the least of these or the ones with the most challenges, it's going to make things better for other groups too. So, because sometimes we're like, why are we, thinking about this from an equity standpoint? Well, if you do for that person, you're going to do for all. So just a thought. All right, Rhonda, you want to take us forward?
Get myself off mute. So I really like how someone had mentioned earlier, you know, that I've already used the word white supremacy a few times, and you know, each of us has different definitions, and each of us has different imagery that comes to mind as well when we hear certain terms. And so it will be important to ground ourselves in some common or a definition that we all can share. Now, when Kelvin and I leave you all can sit with whether or not you agree or disagree with how we've defined these terms. And as a group, you all may want to take the time to define them for yourselves. We're not going to have time for you all to do that today, but we are going to share some terms with you that we think should be pivotal and a part of your discussions moving forward. And it would be nice if you all came to your own group's consensus on how, when you use these words as a task force, what do they mean to you? Because you don't want to be communicating mixed messages when you're trying to share this work to the people, and also for yourself. When you all are having conversations amongst yourselves, everybody needs to be on the same page and make sure that we know how we're defining that term. Because if I ask each one of you to define these terms right now, we may come up with 25 different definitions for each term. And so in order to improve communication, build trust, build community, there does need to be some shared vocabulary. But again, we as an organization, this is how we define the terms, or these are the definitions that we use, and you all can see how they match or compare with what you all have shared. Please note down at the bottom, you see those 3 asterisks, it says from REI. These first 3 definitions we pull verbatim from the Racial Equity Institute out of Greensboro. It's commonly known as REI. And we highly recommend their training, their phase 1 training, and their groundwater training. And so we've been through that training. We pull information from them, and we like to partner with each other and share about each other's work. But this work comes from them, and we want to make sure that we cite our sources. So the first word, racism. And we can share these slides with you all later. But as a former teacher and just I'm forever a student, I do like to write my own notes, and I like to see them in my own handwriting. So feel free to jot these down. This is how we as an organization define racism, and we operate from this lens. Racism equals social and institutional power plus race prejudice. Racism is a system of advantage based on race. Racism is a system of oppression based on race. Racism is a white supremacy system. It's complex. It's greater than individual bigotry and bias, which is a byproduct of racism, and that's the framework from which we operate. We also teach that because institutional power is inherent in racism, and that white supremacy is inherent in racism, that people of color can be bigoted, can be biased, can be prejudiced. But our ability to be racist is not the same as those who identify as white. And so we say that people of color can be bigoted, biased, and prejudiced, but they cannot be racism. They cannot be racist. Can we uphold racism? Can we uphold white supremacy through the positions of leadership that we hold? Yes. But is that institutional power, that history, that web of influence that's inherent in racism? White supremacy. White supremacy is the idea that white people, the ideas, the thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. If I could add something to this definition of white supremacy, I would add that white supremacy is violent. It is violence. And this violence can either be material and physical, right? Or it could be like a soft violence, such as microaggressions. So it doesn't always have to show up with a burning cross, right? It could be symbolic violence. So you have physical violence, you also have symbolic violence, and both of those are inherent in white supremacy. I know someone mentioned earlier, like you think about the KKK and the hoods, but also white supremacy is inherent in the laws we pass. It's inherent in who gets hired and who doesn't. And it's very important that we nuance that definition, because if we only think that white supremacy is what happens in Charlottesville, we miss what happens in the courtroom. We miss what happens in schools and school systems. We miss what happens at the legislature, because that too can uphold white supremacy. And then a system. A system is a set of things that together make a whole. It's an established way of doing something such that things get done regularly without even one having to be in control, right? And it presents itself as, this is just the way things are. This is normal. This is the way things have always been. And it becomes so normalized to us. We think that these systems are fixed parts of our society, but they are not. A system can run by itself, regardless of who the leadership is, regardless of who the president is, regardless of who the CEO is. These systems will run even as you're changing out figureheads. It does not require planning or initiative by a single person or group. That's what a system does. And then what we want you all to apply, to be moving towards, some of you already have this lens, and hopefully we can add to it, and hopefully you can share with the other task force members. We want folks to be developing a racial equity lens and using a racial equity framework. So with racial equity lens, it is a way of thinking about and reflecting upon the ways race, racism, and white supremacy interact with power to create inequality. Power is always present when we're thinking about racism. How are these things interacting with power? It is understanding that race exists whether or not in multiracial spaces. Oftentimes when I'm doing work at different racial equity trainings, people think that if they're in a predominantly white context, that race isn't present and racism isn't present. If we sit with that for a second, that doesn't make sense, right? But also I like to tell people, the reason people of color aren't in that space where you are is probably because of racism. Some type of segregation, some type of power differential is why that space is solely white. Having a racial equity lens is understanding that race is ever present. Race is ever present, and racism is systemic and endemic in our society. And we just need to have the intentionality of trying to point out, how is race intersecting with power in this moment? So as you all are doing this work together as a task force, we have these questions that we think you all should always be asking of yourselves as you're looking at policies, as you're looking at history, as you're looking at data and disaggregating it by race. These are questions that we think will help you to ensure that this racial equity framework is present. So the first one is, who's included and excluded and how? Who's included, who's excluded, and how? What role is race playing in this situation? When you look at a policy and pull it out, these are questions that you ask: who's included in this policy and who's excluded? What role is race playing in this policy? And oftentimes it's going to be subliminal. It's going to be with racially coded language. And so you all have to have the ability to pick that out, because oftentimes that racially coded language is connected to some type of disproportionality where Black and brown folks and folks living in poverty are being targeted. How is race connected to power in this situation? How is race connected to power? You have to find the power sources, because somehow it's being leveraged to either uplift folks or to keep folks oppressed. And you have to be able to locate, where is the power in this? Zooming out, how does this situation connect to patterns of racism? One of the things that is very important that you all recognize, and I know you've heard this language before, particularly as it relates to police brutality. This is an isolated incident. This is an isolated incident. This is an isolated incident. But when you zoom out and you see all the isolated incidences together, you see that there's actually a pattern. There are patterns of racism. This Black Lives Matter movement, while that's currently happening for us right now within the last 5 years, that police brutality has been something that has been challenged and pushed back since the inception of police and policing. This is not new. And so you have to be able to zoom out and look across history to see where are those patterns happening, right? And one question that's left off up here is the last thing that you have to do after you've done this level of reflection and analysis. How can I, as an individual, how can I use my power and my privilege to disrupt these patterns of racism? So you all are going to have to write that one down for yourself. And before I share it out, I'll make sure we add that question. How do I use my power and my privilege to disrupt these patterns of racism? You all are going to have some more time to discuss these once you get into those small groups. Before I transition to Kelvin, I know we've been talking a lot. Anybody have, maybe we have time for like 1 or 2 comments or questions right now?
Rhonda, I don't know if you have any advice. One of the things I struggled with in the small group, and I think we'll struggle with as we go through all of this, is the fact that these are sort of some of the deepest wounds we have, and yet we're talking about this in public and being recorded on YouTube, but we're also making, you know, important recommendations that matter for the public and the state. And I don't know if you have ideas for how to wrestle with that, but I think that's just a reality as we discuss these things.
Yeah, I think that's important to name too. Like, for one, these are not closed door sessions that you all are having. People are going to be watching you as you all are engaging in this. And I think for one thing to hold yourselves to and hold ourselves to is to speak the truth. Share the truth. What is true? And stick to that. And I think every time we speak, we need to be thoughtful about what we're saying. And I know even in this moment, some of us might be a little more guarded, right? But one of the things that I can say is that I can appreciate that level of intentionality that comes into the space and makes us, y'all, I'm pretty sure you all are very laser focused on what comes out of our mouths, because you know what happens when we're not as focused? Those subconscious biases slip out. When we're not paying as attention and we're loose a little bit and we start talking, those biases come out. I mean, eventually you actually need to be in conversation where those biases do come out so that you can address them, right? But that is just something to be thoughtful about. And I will tell you this, even if we weren't in this specific context, right? Anytime you're talking, many of you are public figures, recognize and own when you've made a mistake. Even if you're not being recorded right here in your other jobs and roles, you have to publicly speak. When you mess up, and you surely will, and you probably already have, own what you said. And then seek how you can reconcile. Like, we have to bring humility into those situations. You're going to make mistakes. I'm going to tell you all, you're going to say some things, and you might, after the video cuts off, you might say, oh, wow, I cannot believe I said that. Where did that comment come from? I didn't even know this level of ignorance maybe was inside of me. And then what you do is ask your community, how can I reconcile the harm that I've caused? And if you notice, when people are getting called out, the issue comes when people deny other people's oppression and deny the harm. But for the most part, when people are reflective and say, I messed up, I own that my comment was biased, I own that my comment was racist, I want to reconcile the harm that I have caused. And I think that's a way for us to move forward in a way where we own our mistakes and then think about how can I reconcile to my community and model how to do better, because you're all going to make mistakes. And I think that's one way that we can approach that. Thank you so much for that question. You all continue to hold these questions, because more and more is going to arise for you all. And I'm going to let Kelvin go ahead and move to the next slide to give us a little bit of data.
Yeah, so if we could go to the next slide. One of the things that I do very often in my role with Durham Public Schools is I try to keep our conversations grounded in the data and what we're seeing, what we're hearing from students, but also what we're seeing in statistics and numbers. And I know that was already shared, that there will be a focus of this group also. So with disproportionality, Of course, that reflects the over or underrepresentation of a group in a particular category. So I have a few examples from education here. For example, there's typically an overrepresentation of Black students and American Indian or Native students in special education. What we actually see when you dig into that a little more is that there are certain designations in special education or students with disabilities where there's an overrepresentation. So it may not be as, Black students may not be overrepresented in being identified as autistic, but they may be overrepresented in ADHD, attention deficit or attention deficit hyperactive disorder. So so it's always important to really dig into the data and see what's really going on there and to see where the disproportionality lies. So we also have an example here of underrepresentation of teachers of color in North Carolina. We see that for every 9 white students in North Carolina, there's a white teacher. For every 25 Black students, there's a Black teacher. And for every 109 Latinx students, there's a Latinx teacher. So this is a prime example of disproportionality. So in our system, it's actually pretty unlikely that many of our Latinx students will have a Latinx teacher based on these demographics. And this, we also share this because in my work, this type of information is kind of what drives the work. So we currently have an initiative, particularly around recruiting Latinx teachers in our district, because over a third of the students that we serve are Latinx students, and we have a small number of Latinx teachers. So that's just an example. If we can move to the next slide.
And as we move to the next slide, I wanted to make clear to you all that criminal justice and thinking about it is broad, right? And which angle you could come at and which data source we could bring in. We wanted to bring in specifically education because what happens in schools has a direct correlation to what happens in the criminal justice system. And so we don't want to lose sight of that. And so when we were thinking about how could we narrow in this conversation on criminal justice, we decided to stick to education because, as Kelvin will continue to explain, these two systems, unfortunately, are running parallel and intersecting more often than not.
Yeah, so on this slide, we're going to start to connect more to the criminal justice system. So this is a slide that kind of, according to the U.S. 2019 census estimate, these are the current demographics of North Carolina as a whole. So this is what our state looks like as a whole. If we go to the next slide, we will see, I pulled this from the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, their research bulletin from March of this year. These were the demographics of incarcerated individuals in North Carolina. So if we go to the next slide. So when we, put these side by side and we see the demographics of the people who reside in North Carolina on the left, and we see the demographics of our incarcerated population on the right. And just to be specific, I do think this data is pointing specifically to people who are incarcerated in our state prisons. So it doesn't include like local prisons or federal prisons, et cetera. So we look at these two charts. If we had perfect proportionality, they will be identical. Clearly, there are some differences there. We wanted to do this in chat, but if we have a volunteer just to share out, how would you describe the disproportionality you see between these two pie charts? If we have a volunteer to share out, how would you describe the disproportionality between these two charts?
Okay. Well, it's apparent that Black citizens are being incarcerated at twice the level of white citizens, African Americans making 22% of the population, make up 50% of the imprisoned population. You know, and I think the reverse, 39% of the imprisoned population is white, whereas in the general population is 62%. I think that suggests where the law enforcement interest is. It suggests where and how the prosecutorial authorities are raised. I think there could be a chart here about who's serving life sentences, who's serving sentences over 20 years or over 40 years. And the disproportionate nature of those numbers would jump out every bit as much as these figures jump out. And so the question that you've raised before is, this is not a one-off. This is part of a system that increasingly identifies and criminalizes the Black population. So it's a powerful demographic, and I think these numbers and similar numbers are part of what this task force is going to have to grapple with.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Hill. And so, just to reiterate again, less than 25% of people who live in North Carolina are Black. So they are over twice represented. And so less than 25% of the people who live here are Black, but over 50%. Just over half of the incarcerated population is Black. That's an egregious example of disproportionality. If we can go to the next slide. Rhonda mentioned earlier that, we see this play out in schools also. So if we look at the same, charts for North Carolina public schools on the left, these are the students enrolled in North Carolina public schools, and we look at short-term suspensions in North Carolina public schools, you can almost map the two charts on top of each other from the previous slide. So, and we know that there's data that's been collected that about almost half of young people who get referred to the court system get referred through the schools, and Black students are very much overrepresented in the young people who get referred to our court system directly from school. So that's a direct line from the school to prison pipeline. So we share this, and if you could go to the next slide. We share this because it's important for us to know our data. But once we know our data, it is very important that we challenge our biases, because our biases would lead us to believe that the disproportionality that we see in our systems are due to some sort of a deficiency in people of color. Our biases don't cause us to analyze or look at systems and how systems contribute to disproportionality. We immediately go to blaming people who have been victims within the systems. So we must know our data. We must challenge our biases. Like Rhonda was saying, things have been done a certain way for a long time. And so we're used to doing things, and we're used to thinking about things a certain way. How do we break outside of that and start to think, okay, how might our policies, how might our practices contribute to what we see? And once we start challenging those biases, one of the things we can do is analyze the root causes that lead to the disproportionality. That's one of the things that we do in education, and we encourage you all to do in the criminal justice system also. If we could go to the next slide. One of the things that we do when we see disproportionality in suspensions is we start that question, okay, what are kids getting suspended for? So as I was researching in that same bulletin from the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, I found the most frequent crimes for inmates entering prison. And the number one offense was non-trafficking drug offenses. Now, some of these may be paired also with other offenses in people entering the system, but the number one offense was non-trafficking drug offenses. Now, we look at that data, again, we have to challenge our biases. because our biases will tell us, well, it must be that Black people are using drugs at disproportionate rates than others. But if we go to the other slide, I think we were able to put this in. The CDC reported in 2018 that there were similar trends in illicit drug use for Blacks, Latinos, and whites in 2017. When you really dig into the data, there were slightly higher rates of Blacks using marijuana, but slightly higher rates of whites misusing prescription drugs. Yet, there are significant racial disparities in incarceration rates for drug offenses. So, if we know that Blacks are not more likely than whites to use drugs, but we see disproportionality in the enforcement of drug laws, then we have to start questioning the laws, our enforcement practices. How are we contributing to the disproportionality we see in who's actually incarcerated, on probation, on parole, etc.? If we can go to, this was a video kind of capturing some thoughts on like the history of disproportionality in criminal justice, dating back to like the 1970s or 80s. We won't have time for that today, but we can share that with you. So we're going to briefly go into our breakout rooms. And these are our discussion questions for our breakout rooms. We want to think, as we look at this data, what are your thoughts about it? How does it make you feel? Like, we hope that within this, like, it's important to look at numbers, but it's also important to hear stories. It's also important to look at this through an empathetic lens to think about, okay, how do I feel about this? And then, just briefly, we want to start to think, what might be some of our next steps to make our criminal justice system more just? So we call it our criminal justice system, yet we see that there can be a lack of justice within the system. So how do we make it more just? Or what might be our next steps from here? So these are our discussion questions. We're going to go back into our breakout rooms, I think, for maybe 8 minutes or so, and then we'll just come back and conclude or wrap up, or it may be 5 minutes. Dr. Ronda Taylor Bullock will let us know. Yeah. So
yeah, I think we have time for a good 8 to 9 minute discussion, knowing that we're planting seeds today. You all know that this conversation is not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough time, right? But at least, again, this is to ground us in this framework. And so let's just say that you all will be in there for about 9 minutes. We'll come back at 12:55 and then kind of bring us to a close. But while you're in there, if someone could jot down take some notes from what you all share out, because these will be some questions that you all can continue to have moving forward. Kelvin, you about to say something?
Yeah, there's one thing I want to say now so I don't forget later. I know that this task force is thinking about strategies for making sure that law enforcement is de-escalating situations and things of that nature. We also want to think about how the criminalization of certain offenses might contribute to how we respond to certain situations. So that de-escalation, if there's a lot of apprehension and fear around drug use in certain communities, that can impact how we go about handling situations when we go into certain areas. And we do see how that can contribute to excessive force being used in situations that likely did not warrant that. So I just want us to think about that also, not necessarily now, but moving forward. But yeah, again, our questions are, what are your thoughts about the data? How does it make you feel? What might be some of our next steps? So if we can go into our breakout rooms.
And Ellen, can I ask you to be our note taker?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So I had written down the questions, if it's helpful for me to read them out again. The first one is, what are your thoughts about this data? How does it make you feel? And what might be our next steps to make our criminal justice system more just?
Thanks.
I'll start off and saying this: the data itself is not surprising, or it's not new, I should say. It seems that for years I've heard about the disparities in the incarceration rate as it relates to the population rate, and I don't know as a society that we've done a whole lot with that information other than collect it for years and bring it up over the years as incidents arise. One of the things I think about when I first start hearing numbers, and I'm very skeptical with numbers sometimes because I know the ease in which numbers can be used to kind of present an argument. One of the first things I like to kind of, or I go back to, is behavior. What is the behavior that leads to these numbers as well? And I think sometimes that gets missed in the conversation. And I heard someone say it earlier today that, you know, we cannot get lost in the fact that some of this has to start at home with our children at the earliest of ages to kind of prevent this data from continuing. It continues to go and go and go, and we continue to talk and talk and talk about it. But, you know, I would be interested in what, as a society, particularly in North Carolina, because that's where we're at, what have we done to kind of address it over the years, and what is going to make this approach or this attempt, you know, much different? If we're not trying to intercept and intervene on behavior, you know, we're going to constantly run into this data as it relates to the disproportionality of incarceration and crime and the way that the laws and the enforcement, for a matter of fact, is structured as well.
My thoughts on viewing that data, like you mentioned, is not nothing new, especially coming from a marginalized community. So I actually see the disproportionate rate in which Black people are frankly locked up and incarcerated at a higher rate than any other particular group of individuals. And so my thoughts is, just to see the data though is still disheartening when I see it, even though I see it on a daily basis. And the feelings, it's so many, to be honest, especially coming from being a Black male, and being at any moment, if I'm just driving my car, that I'm more likely to be pulled over statistically than any of my counterparts. And so the feeling is just downtrodden feelings. But next steps, so we're speaking on the problems, but we should most definitely focus on the solution, which this task force is doing. So next steps to fix the criminal justice system, I believe, is confronting these issues head on, like we're doing with this data, and being honest and having open, honest dialogues in order to fix this, and pointing out the biasness that we might not even really understand that we have, and accepting that and addressing those issues. And let's make this criminal justice system in North Carolina better.
I believe the data that we were presented today is just a small snapshot of the data that's actually needed to fully understand the issues that we face, not only on the law enforcement side, but in the criminal justice side, speaking as in the court system, because, you know, we have to break out to find out where racism exists within the law enforcement profession. We have to break out calls for service versus self-initiated calls. If you look at that, we can have a number of calls for service from a variety of communities. We cannot not respond to those calls. We have to respond to those calls as they come in within law enforcement. But then you can look at the officer-initiated calls for service and those interactions and how they take place. And then we can determine where those problems exist, have a clear understanding of it or a clear picture of it with that kind of data. I think moving forward, to help us understand that, we need to collect that data. We've looked at that in our own agency. And you can, it starts with naturally traffic stop reports. You can see or get an understanding of those as well. But again, we also have to be mindful of where the volume of calls are coming in with respect to law enforcement, and in crimes being committed within communities, our calls for service, and then who's actually committing those crimes. So we have to pull all of that information together to better understand what we're looking at in our respective communities and in our state as a whole.
Yeah, I would also say that when I saw those numbers, like it immediately made me think of all the other data that we really need and we need it not in a sense of like proving that there's an issue that should be addressed, but I do think that I guess I would go back to this notion that you can only manage what you measure, and so the only way we can set goals and meet them is to measure the things that we think need to change, and so the very basic information we got today doesn't begin to capture the types of information that we could be using to measure whether the reform that we are trying to put in place really does ultimately address the problem. So I guess that was, I just immediately thought we need so much more, and we have it. We there's a lot more information and available that will help explain, that will help disaggregate and make clear why that's going on. So I'll just give one example. I know there's been a study of women sentenced in North Carolina that found that dark-skinned African-American women were on average sentenced to more time for the same offenses than light-skinned African-American women. So even just within, so you can break down the information and begin to see all the different ways that racial biases play into the discretionary decisions that are made by the actors within the system. And so the answer of how we begin to address the problem, I guess I'm saying we start with a lot more data.
This is great. 10 seconds remaining. I think I'm going to extend everyone 1 minute. I will say I really second this idea that this data is not new and not surprising. And I think the way it makes me feel is still, I guess, angry that there's still some need to like justify to people that this is a problem, seeing that it should be obvious at this point. And it does make me angry that it's not to people. But I think there is a need to tie that data to the way we behave in the criminal justice system. There's no longer a need to admire it, but to use it to make different decisions on the ground. So I hope that's part of what this task force will do. Okay, I'm gonna close us now. I'll see you guys back in the main room.
Good, thank you.
Okay.
Let's see. I don't know how you all's discussions went, but we were all like grasping for the last 10 seconds, 15 seconds to share things. And hopefully you all were doing that too. And again, this was just a grounding for a conversation. You all know that this wasn't sufficient to do anything except let us reiterate the need and the importance and the significance of the work that you all are going to be doing. As you all are looking at and analyzing policies and looking at the language to see how these policies are upholding disproportionalities. How are they reinforcing white supremacy? How are they reinforcing racial oppression? And I look forward to the work that you all are going to be doing. I look forward to, if Jasmine sees fit, if we can come back and continue to help you all wrestle with and move through some of this work. You know, this is just a sample of some of the stuff that we do and we believe in. I'm passionate about it. I felt you all's passion about doing this work. And, you know, sometimes doing anti-racism work, it can feel hopeless. When you look at the years of systemic oppression, it feels hopeless. But there's power in a hopeless place, because that hopelessness is going to drive us to do things we've never done before. It's going to drive you all to create changes that had not been present before. And I believe that you all harness that hopelessness, you harness that energy, you also harness the hope, because I do believe that with this level of intentionality, this task force can make a difference in how crime is punished, how folks are held accountable, both perpetrators and also victims. And whether it's the police force, whether it's the citizens, whether it's other systems, I believe that you all will be doing something that we have never done before, and we got to hang our hats on that and move forward. Thank you all so much for your time and attention and allowing us to be a part of this space and to be a part of this work. And I don't know if Kelvin has anything else he wants to say, but I just want to say thank you all. I'm excited that this work is happening. If you can tell, I get excited. This is the work that I believe is so important. And is integral for us to live in a racially just, racially equitable society.
No, I'm good. Thank you all.
Everybody, let us thank Ronda and Daniel. What a very helpful. Anita, I didn't know if you wanted to offer any preliminary reactions.
Well, no, I'm just grateful to everyone for sticking with us through this meeting, and hope that you will feel free to give us feedback on all of the things that we've raised so far, either through the surveys or through emails to me or to Josh or to any of the staff. But I'm really looking forward to working with everyone. Thank you.
Great. And very much enjoyed Ronda and Daniel's presentation, talking about race, talking about racism, talking about racial inequities. They gave us a good grounding in language and concepts. Racism is just ugly, and it's not easy to talk about ugly things. And we're all nervous about saying something that might come out the wrong way, but we have to tackle these issues. Our job is to try to improve our criminal justice system so we can weed out all of the disparities that we were talking about earlier, to confront it so that we can neutralize it. And we have a big job ahead of us. You will be getting over the next couple weeks, this week, some emails mentioned earlier, questionnaire, survey on the working groups. So turn those around. What we're trying to do is use your time efficiently so that when we meet again in 2 weeks from today, we can advance the ball even quicker. And so very much looking forward to doing this work with you all. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.